I'd like to continue talking about establishing rigor and trustworthiness, now focusing on the qualitative methods. And the article that I asked you to read by Shenton that reviews qualitative criteria for trustworthiness. And then they provided numerous techniques and strategies for achieving this credibility. And this week, I'm asking you to, overview what you've done so far in your grant process, your grant writing process for your research, and also add with that, how you might start to think about establishing trustworthiness or rigor within your qualitative project. So think about this in terms of credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And I've given you this as a handout, so you have it on Blackboard. But and the article, does describe these things really well. Credibility is one of the most important things in terms of trustworthiness of research. It's really, like I said, the truth, the idea of how congruent are the findings with reality. Is there adequate representation? Is there multiple perspectives? Are your interpretations acceptable? And techniques are to really make sure your methods align with your research aims. They talk about random sampling, but I'm not for that. I wouldn't want to get into that. We talk about purposeful sampling. Are you getting people who are able to give you the rich information that you need and actually give you enough information that you're able to do your analysis? Prolonged engagement has to do with even, like taking on observation before you jump in and start designing a project and asking questions. Keeping a reflexive journal, reducing desirability, that has to do with, making sure that there's that you're not impacting people, your respondents, in a way that makes them answer in a biased way, but also that you're reflecting on your own place in the research, how you are able to work with the data and keep it to be grounded in what you're hearing from the participants as opposed to what your assumptions are. Using multiple sources and sites and methods in your research if possible. Member checking is something I try to do always, is invite people back who have taken part in my research to hear my preliminary findings and tell me, do they make sense? Like I say, are the interpretations acceptable? Also, peer examination, just talking with your peers, people who know qualitative methods, people who know the topic. Does this make sense what I'm hearing? What are you hearing in this research? And then also comparing it with your literature. You should know a little bit about what you're going into, even though you don't want to only go by what you've read in the literature because, you're in a new context and you want to be open to hearing what people have to say. But also, looking at the literature, does what you're saying make sense given your context and what's already been written? Transferability is similarity of contexts, just generalizability to another context, findings that may be applied. And so this is making sure that you provide rich and thick description of your context, how your study took place, anything that happened in your study that might have impacted your findings, and the context in terms of culture and history. Remember, we're not controlling for those things. We're keeping them because that is a part of the research. That's the thick description. Dependability. All factors that change are taken into account. Reliability of the process. So, thick description of your process, an external audit of your process. Would somebody else, find something that tripped up in your research process? Using multiple methods to kind of minimize some of the issues that have to do with maybe people not showing up to focus groups or people not showing up to their interviews, trying to develop multiple methods that make it something more dependable. And confirmability, the extent your findings are grounded in the data itself. And that, again, is triangulation, making sure you have strong methods coming together in different ways that enable you to say that your data is good and your findings come from that data. And also being very, very reflective, keeping a diary of all that you've done in your research, how things might impact you, how How are your methods going? How is your analysis going? What are your decisions that you've made while conducting your analysis? Is every time somebody mentions the word, I felt blessed, is that going to be coded as something spiritual, or is it not? Those are kinds of weird little things that you have to think about, but it's good to keep an audit trail of those things so that it's consistent throughout your project and very transparent. And some strategies, just very general across these different types of rigor, activities in the field, prolonged engagement, like I said, really getting to know where you're at, getting to know the culture, understanding the historic context in which you're working. So observation is a big part of it, and trying to use multiple sources, methods, and investigators to help you. It's good to have people work with you. I know that people feel like they have to do their homework by themselves, but sometimes two heads are better than one. Debriefing is a big thing with your participants or with the colleagues. Negative case analysis is when you have an idea of what you think is coming out of your data, but is there someone that you've talked to who's totally different? Or is there somebody you could talk with that might have had a totally different take on something? And I'll give you an example. In my work with the women in North Carolina, we found that most of them, they were talking about their reliance on God to help them through their cancer, even though they also got their treatment taken. So, could I find somebody who didn't rely on God to talk about what that felt like for them? Was there a negative, somebody who was very different than I was finding? So I wouldn't just discount all alternative explanations for what got these women through their cancer and help them define cancer survivorship for themselves. Was belief in God such a big process, such a big component that nothing else would be in there? And so, what degree, was it a degree of belief in God, or was it that everybody in this context believed in God? And what I found was, for the women that I spoke with in this area, religiosity was a huge component, but there were different ways of obviously believing in God. And so I did talk with people from multiple denominations, multiple belief practices to get a more full understanding of how the spirituality and religiosity impacted survivorship. So that was my negative case analysis. Member checking. When I have preliminary results after going through my data and analyzing my data, which we'll start to do soon in our course, I always try to present my findings to at least some of the participants of my study to find out what they think. Is this something they think is appropriate? Am I hitting the mark, or am I missing the mark on different things? And so that's super helpful. Again, thick description is really important, being able to really understand what is the context in which you're working. And then an audit trail or reflexive journal. I don't always do this. I'm not very good at that. I'm not a journaler, but I did for my dissertation. I kept notes on every time I met for conducting my research. Whenever I worked on my research, whenever I had a phone call, I recorded what it was, how it impacted my research. As I did my analysis, I kept track of my decision making that I did across my analyses. When something big happened in my research, working with cancer survivors is a difficult thing because while people are doing well, people do have recurrences, and some people actually pass away. So how did that impact me in terms of looking at my data from then on? And so I kept a reflexive journal on those things, and it was very helpful, not just for myself, but I was able to look at that and actually really round out how I wrote my dissertation as well. So finally, a little bit more about this idea of documentation and audit trail. These could be contextual, such as just writing your field notes. You can have audit trail regarding your methods, your analysis, your personal responses to things going on, and then also this reflexivity, this idea of how am I impacting my research? May my biases or my my prior learning or my assumptions be impacting my decisions? And these are not all separate journals. They're just different ways that you can write, different things you might write about. So I'm going to stop here, and I'd like you to think about in your own research how rigor can be, what strategies you might do to enhance rigor in terms of credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability.